My name is Roger Berkowitz, and welcome to the Hannah Arendt Center's virtual reading group. Today, we're reading Hannah Arendt's essay, Lying in Politics, Reflections on the Vietnam War. This is an essay that she originally published in 1971 in the New York Review of Books. The version we're reading is from the book Crises of the Republic, and it begins on page 5. The essay takes place in 4 parts, as do so many of these essays of Arendt's that we're reading. And part 1 begins with the facts of the Pentagon Papers, this review of the Vietnam War and the mistakes that were made, run by Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. And she asks this question, that why so many lies were told. Why is it that the government not only deceived the Vietnamese, but more importantly, deceived its own people, the Americans, and perhaps most importantly, deceived itself. And so this question that she thinks the Pentagon Papers raises is the question of deception, but also, and quite distinctly, the question of self-deception. She begins with a number of reflections on the questions of lying and truth and politics. What is the importance or role and the difficulty of thinking about truth in politics and lying in politics? And on page 5, she writes that it is a characteristic of human action that it always begins something new. And this does not mean that it is ever permitted to start ab ovo, to create ex nihilo, so to start from nothing. So human action, this capacity to do something, to be free, to create, to begin anew, always begins something new. It thus changes the world in a meaningful way. And if it's going to change the world, human action has to, in a sense, destroy the world that already existed. There must be a space for something new to come in. And thus, action, political action, freedom, depends upon the ability to imagine ourselves in a new space, in a place that we aren't. And in that way, lying, this ability to create something that was not there, to make something up, to imagine things differently. Lying is at the very root of political action. So she'll write, such change, a change that is a kind of new action in politics, would be impossible if we could not mentally remove ourselves from where we physically are located and imagine that things might as well be different from what they actually are. In other words, the deliberate denial of factual truth, the ability to lie, and the capacity to act are interconnected. They owe their existence to the same source, imagination. So this sets up the problematic of the essay that real political action requires a lie. I mean, if you want to say, like Martin Luther King did, that, all men are equal and that we're going to lay down and live in a world in which color may not make a difference, and we have a dream where this could happen, that's not the way it is. And so you're going to have to change the way it is, and you're going to have to, in a sense, imagine an alternative universe, which is a lie, and then bring that into being, act to do so. And so there is a way in which she thinks that lying is at the very centrality of politics. And yet, the central nature of lying in politics is deeply dangerous. And the fundamental danger, I think, as she expresses it, is that it is very easy for lies to become believed. And this is true for a couple of reasons. The first is that facts are contingent. all facts could be otherwise, at least all facts that are humanly made. It's just, the fact that I'm here and you are there, the fact that I teach Hannah Arendt, the fact that the United States of America exists could have been otherwise. The fact that England decided this week to leave the European Union could have been otherwise. All facts, because they're contingent, are not compellingly true. They could be otherwise. And in fact, and this is the key for her, sometimes it would make more sense if they were otherwise. Some facts seem really disturbing and annoying, and they upset our understanding of the way the world should be. And thus, she writes on pages 6 to 7, it is this fragility of facts that makes deception so very easy up to a point, and so tempting. It never comes into conflict with reason, namely deception. Deception doesn't conflict with our reason. When we lie, the lies are not irrational. In fact, they may be more rational than the factual truths. And this is because things could have been as the liar maintains they were. Lies are often much more plausible, more appealing to reason than reality, since the liar has the great advantage of knowing beforehand what the audience wishes or expects to hear. He has prepared a story for public consumption with a careful eye to making credible, whereas reality has the disconcerting effect and habit of confronting us with the unexpected for which we are not prepared. This is, to me, an obvious and yet deeply important insight of Hannah Arendt's. She develops it, first time I know of, in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talks about the fact that Hitler and Stalin both were able to succeed to the extent they did in creating totalitarian regimes because the consistent lies they told were more appealing to the Germans and the Soviets than reality. And that even though people knew that the lies they were being told didn't conform with reality, they preferred to believe the lie than reality because the lie was more compelling, more real to them, in the sense that they preferred that world better. And what she says is that lying, consistent lying, is in many ways more compelling and more attuned to the needs of humanity than is the difficult, messy, often incomprehensible reality of the factual world. And this is, to her, the temptation that always exists of lies overtaking reality in politics. Now, as I said, lying is part of politics, but the danger is that the lie is not just a lie that helps us imagine a new world and gets us to a place we want to be, but that the lie actually begins to replace the real in a way that deteriorates our belief in reality. Right? That's really the key. And she says, and this is on page 7, there always comes the point beyond which lying becomes counterproductive. This point is when the audience to which the lies are addressed is forced to disregard altogether the distinguishing line between truth and falsehood in order to be able to survive. So, in order to survive, to keep ourselves alive, we accept the lie. We accept the world as it is, and we play along with it so that we can continue to stay alive, get food, get the perks of being a party member, whatever it is. And at that point, truth that can be relied on, that's not simply arbitrary, disappears entirely from public life. And with it, the disappearance of truth, also disappears the chief stabilizing factor in the ever-changing affairs of men. And it's this danger that the world becomes completely unstable that Arendt says is in many ways the limit of the lie. Because if it gets to that point, at some point, the people are going to insist on stability, because stability too is a requirement of living a human life. And so there's a limit to how far lies can go. And this is a good thing, right? This means that, and this is something she believes, totalitarianism can never fully succeed. Because as it succeeds more and more, it will have to ramp up the efficacy and power of its lying. And as it does so, it deteriorates the trust people have in the common world, and eventually people will rebel against the complete lying reality of a totalitarian world. It can get pretty bad, right? Nazism and Stalinism both are examples of that. But the good news from her point of view is it can't be complete. So that's sort of the introduction and the background to the book, to this essay. And she then wants to raise a question, which is, why was in a democracy like the United States of America was, she hopes, in the 1960s, and why was a group of government officials able to so consistently lie? And that is the lesson of the Pentagon Papers. It's not that the people didn't know the facts. They lied to the American people, and often to their colleagues, and even to themselves. And she suggests that it has something to do with something like public relations and the rise of public relations, and this idea that the war was really fought for an image, not to actually win or to acquire land, but to keep alive the image of America as the world power and the image of America as a trusted ally. But she really moves beyond the public relations argument quickly, and the argument argument that I find most challenging and compelling, difficult and yet provocative in this essay, is her continual effort to understand what she calls the problem solvers. This is a group of people that she also talks about in her essay on violence, and it pops up in other essays and books that she writes. But she is interested in this question of the elites, the political elites. So in On Violence, which we read a couple months ago, we spent some time on her line where she says the entry of problem solvers and intellectuals from universities and colleges into government is one of the great threats to freedom in the modern age. And why is that? And here she's pursuing that line as well, and I want to focus on that in the reading today. So on page 12, she writes about problem solvers. Quote, their distinction from ordinary image makers and public relations men lies in that they were problem solvers as well. Hence, they were not just intelligent, but prided themselves on being rational. And they were indeed rational to a rather frightening degree above sentimentality, and in love with theory, the world of sheer mental effort. They were eager to find formulas, preferably expressed in pseudo-mathematical language, that they would unify the most desperate phenomena with reality presented to them. So, what does she mean by problem solvers? Well, they're intellectuals, they're rational, not so sentimental, they love theory, they love the world of the sheer mental effort, and they loved formulas. that would unify the most disparate phenomena with the reality presented to them. There's an attempt to take, and this is to her something she talks about in so many of her books. It's clearly one of the great worries that she has about our modern world. Problem solvers are people who attempt to bring human reality in all its complexity, irrationality, freedom, unpredictability, and make it comprehensible, make it fit into rules and patterns and laws. Problem solvers are generally social scientists, right? They're people who think you can study human behavior and come up with rules that will explain and predict and allow us to, in a sense, better direct that human behavior. She continues on page 12 and writes, men who act to the extent that they feel themselves to be the masters of their own futures. So we act and we can control our future. We can improve the world. Will forever be tempted to fit their reality, which after all was man-made to begin with, and thus could have been otherwise, to fit their reality into their theory, thereby mentally getting rid of its disconcerting contingency. So it's this decision, this desire to make the messy world fit with a theory that Arendt attributes to problem solvers. And she is deeply worried that these problem solvers who enter into politics with John F. Kennedy in the kitchen cabinet and become the best and the brightest, who begin to lead this war effort. What she's saying is somehow, because they were so caught up in theory, they lost track of reality. On page 12, again, she talks about the modern arsenal of political theory, game theory, systems analysis, etc. And she talks about the way problem solvers think. And anyone who's ever watched a pundit on TV will recognize this argument. They start and they say, well, there's three scenarios. There's the A scenario, the B scenario, and the C scenario. And the A and C are sort of opposite extremes, and B is sort of the logical middle of the road solution to the problem. And what Arendt says about this is the kind of thinking that presents both A and C as undesirable and therefore settles on B hardly serves any other purpose than to divert the mind and blunt the judgment for the multitude of real possibilities. So again, we think of that as an eminently sensible way. You know, Donald Trump is too conservative, Bernie Sanders is too liberal, nice middle road, Hillary Clinton. There's 100 different ways of thinking about this. We don't want the extremes, we want the middle road. But what Arendt is saying is this kind of problem solving, this kind of punditry, is a kind of lying. It's an attempt to get rid of facts and the confidence that this should be possible because of the inherent contingency of facts. She's not saying the extremes are good. She's not saying don't cut off the extremes. What she's saying is, in the effort to rationalize and theorize and, in a sense, mentally control the situation, what problem solvers as a group do is impose kind of their theory on the world, and that doesn't actually address the complexity and reality of the world. I'm going to just stop for a second and say, I'm recording this the day after the United Kingdom decided to remove itself from the European Union. And we've been reading, or I've been reading all morning and late last night because I was obsessed with it, all these people talking about the elites versus the people and how there's this enormous anti-elitism and populism, all of which is right. And yet this, I think Hannah Arendt in important ways, offers us a way to think about this anti-elitism and this populism in a way that's, I hope, productive. She's not anti-expert in the sense that she's not opposed to people who actually know something about what they're talking about. The problem with Indochina, the war in Vietnam, she said, is that most of these Harvard-educated systems analysts who were doing the work for the Pentagon actually knew painfully little about Indochina. They weren't experts in Indochina; they were experts in political thinking. And much the same could be said of people who are today remaking our educational system. Very few of them are teachers. They are educational experts, whatever that is. Maybe they taught for a couple of years here and there, but for the most part, they're people trained in educational policy or educational something. And I think what you're seeing around the world is a real loss of patience with experts who often know very little bit about the things they're experts on, coming in and telling people they're wrong. And the people are sort of starting to say, enough's enough, which is not to say that the populists have it right, but it is to say that there is a danger in this kind of expert analysis that Arendt, I think, helps us to see. On page 18, she writes, "What is surprising is the eagerness of those scores of intellectuals who offered their enthusiastic help in this imaginary enterprise. Perhaps they were fascinated by the sheer size of the mental exercises it seemed to demand." One of the things that I'm struggling with constantly with Hannah Arendt is how to understand her real disdain for intellectuals. She's not an anti-intellectual, right? She's an intellectual. She's someone who lives and drives by writing and reading and thinking. She's a big believer in thinking. But a lot of what she's trying to do is to suggest that many of the people who we call intellectuals, many of the people who are the experts and problem solvers who we put in charge of education or the environment or global warming, are actually people who know very little bit about what they're controlling or supposedly trying to solve the problems for, and are better trained in sort of systems analysis and political theory and who knows what else. And they love the mental challenge of management consulting. Going in, that's what a management consultant does. You go in, you don't know much about the industry, but you know management consulting, and you come up with solutions. But those solutions often mean putting thousands of people out of work, tearing a factory down here, building one there, and it may work in some way, but it's incredibly disruptive. And it's this love of the kind of intellectual engagement in mental exercises that Arendt is so suspicious of. It's a remoteness from reality, as she says on page 20, that she finds really disturbing. And on pages 18 and 19, she writes, "Again, it may be only natural for problem solvers, trained in translating all factual contents into the language of numbers and percentages, where they can be calculated, to remain unaware of the untold misery that their solutions, pacification and relocation programs, defoliation, napalm, and anti-personal bullets, held in store for a quote-unquote friend who needed to be saved, and for an enemy who had neither the will nor the power to be one before." So I've been trying to focus us on this idea of problem solving and its centrality to Arendt. And I want to just turn to the end of the essay on pages 39 to 42, where she writes, quote, on 39, "The problem solvers who lost their minds because they trusted the calculating powers of their brains at the expense of the mind's capacity for experience and its ability to learn from it were preceded by the ideologists of the Cold War period." So the problem solvers remove themselves from reality by this kind of mental effort of abstraction. And they do even though they're quite different from ideologists, because they don't have a strong ideology, but they do what the ideologists do as well. They abstract themselves from reality and replace it. The ideologists replace it with an ideological view, a coherent ideology, and the problem solvers replace it with a methodology that allows them to, in many ways, defend a theory that looks good and sounds good, but often has very little to do with reality. And this brings us to the root of the matter, she says on page 42 at the end of the essay. And she writes, quote, defactualization and problem solving were welcomed because disregard of reality was inherent in the policies and goals themselves. What did they have to know about Indochina as it really was, when it was no more than a test case or a domino, or a means to contain China, or prove that we are the mightiest of superpowers? So the problem solvers weren't actually out there to make Indochina better, right? They were there to prove or disprove the domino theory, or to show that the United States was a reliable international partner. They weren't out there to actually make Indochina better. That wasn't their goal. And I'll just speak about this from something I ostensibly know something about, which is teaching. We see so many proposals for how to deal with and reform teaching. But what are they about, right? Some of them are about getting more people ready for the workforce, right? A laudable goal, but one that has a somewhat refracted and distant connection to what some of us think teaching is. A lot of it is about creating equality. Again, a laudable goal, but not necessarily, again, the same would lead to the same methods as what some of us think teaching is. And so this is just an example, which is to say that the policymakers who get up there and come up with policies that are well thought out and cut out the extremes and go towards the middle are often very brilliant and very smart, but they're often approaching it without the messiness and the difficulty of the reality of what a teacher does or what would make Indochina better, and are actually out there trying to solve a problem which is often quite divorced from what the people teaching or living in Indochina might see as their reality. And Lying in Politics, as an essay, is about the ease with which the rise of problem solving defactualizes our politics in ways that can be dangerous. I look forward to discussing the essay with you during the reading group. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.